The sound of falling water echoed through the pristine courtyard of Harrison Dynamics. Yet for Leo Harrison, the world was silent. His father, Alexander Harrison, one of the youngest billionaires in the country, paced through the courtyard, unaware of the quiet that had enveloped his son for 9 long years. Despite all the money in the world, Leo's world remained untouched by sound. Doctors, specialists, and the best technology had all failed to bring him what he needed most. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Let's start. For Alexander, silence was something that could be bought, fixed, or eliminated. His wealth had solved every problem life had thrown at him, except for this one, his son's deafness. Leo sat on a stone bench near the fountain, the gentle splashes of water offering no comfort, just a reminder of what he couldn't hear. His father, locked in a world of high-powered meetings and deals, barely spared him a glance as he disappeared through the glass doors of the building. And then, a strange thing happened. A barefoot girl, her skin darkened by the sun, slipped past the security gates unnoticed, a basket of carved wooden charms balanced in her hands. She wasn't supposed to be here. She didn't belong in this polished world. But as her eyes caught Leo's, something in her gaze made her stop. Leo shifted, rubbing his ear, a habitual gesture, his face contorting slightly in discomfort. The girl, who had been weaving through the crowd without a second glance at anyone, hesitated. She watched Leo for a moment, noticing his hearing aids, his stillness. There was something about him that made her want to approach. She raised her hand, clumsily signing, "Hello." Leo blinked, startled. Few strangers ever tried to connect with him. He signed back, his hands shaky. "You know signs?" "A little," she said, her fingers fumbled. "My brother couldn't talk." For the first time in years, Leo felt like someone understood him. Someone saw him for who he really was. Not the son of a billionaire, but just a boy desperate for a connection. Ella didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something that would turn everything upside down for Leo. As they sat together on the stone bench, talking about their lives, something about the way Ella spoke, about her brother, about the medical neglect her family had faced, clicked inside of Leo. His silence, his isolation, suddenly didn't feel as insurmountable. And then, as they talked, something strange happened. Leo rubbed his ear again, wincing, and Ella, with a gentle but determined touch, reached toward him, unaware that this small act would unravel everything. And then, as they talked, something strange happened. Leo rubbed his ear again, wincing, his fingers pressed against the soft skin just beneath the hearing aid, his face contorting in discomfort. His breath hitched slightly, as if the sensation was too much to ignore. Ella, watching him, noticed the way he seemed to grimace each time he touched his ear. She felt the urge to reach out, to ask more. But she wasn't sure if she should, if this was something too private for him to share. But then Leo shifted again, this time with more urgency, as if trying to scratch at something just out of reach inside his ear. Ella felt a pang of concern. Her fingers twitched, her instincts pushing her toward him. "Does it hurt?" she asked softly, her voice barely above the hum of the city in the distance. Leo shook his head, though it didn't seem convincing. He reached up again, rubbing his ear with more force. "Itches inside," he signed hesitantly, his fingers trembling as he mimicked the movement of scratching. "Always. Doctors say nothing wrong." Ella's brow furrowed as she watched him. She didn't know much about medical conditions, but she could tell that this wasn't something small. Her own brother, when he had been alive, had suffered from a similar kind of neglect, a silence that no one had cared to fix, a silence that had come to define his life. For a moment, Ella wondered if Leo's silence was something that no doctor had truly looked at closely enough, something that only someone who had been through their own kind of pain could truly see. "Let me help," she said, her voice low but firm. Leo's eyes widened, uncertainty flickering in them, but he didn't pull away. Perhaps he was too used to people telling him what was wrong, too used to specialists poking and prodding without ever getting any answers. Maybe this girl, this strange barefoot vendor who had appeared from nowhere, was his last hope. Ella gently reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she moved toward Leo's ear. She didn't ask for permission. It wasn't her place to ask. All she knew was that she had to try. She had seen something in his eyes, something familiar, something she couldn't ignore. "Hold still," she whispered, her fingers brushing against the edge of his ear. Leo tensed, his body stiffening as if bracing for something unknown. Ella's hand lingered just for a moment before she pressed a little closer, her fingertips carefully tracing the inside of his ear. A shudder ran through Leo. He didn't pull away, but his entire posture was stiff, as though every muscle in his body was fighting the act, yet also needing it. Then, with a soft gasp, Ella's fingers brushed against something strange, something brittle, something that shouldn't have been there. Her breath caught in her throat as her hand instinctively drew back. Leo looked at her, confusion painting his features. "What is it?" he signed, his eyes searching her face. Ella didn't know what to say at first. In her hand, wrapped between her trembling fingers, was a small object, black, like a dried husk, yet almost alive. It pulsed faintly in the sunlight, a soft, unnerving vibration that almost felt like it was breathing. I think it's something inside you," Ella whispered, unsure if she was making sense. Leo's heart raced, and for a moment, his mind couldn't keep up with what was happening. He blinked rapidly, his fingers unconsciously reaching for the strange object in her hand. The moment his skin made contact with it, a sudden rush of sensations flooded his body. The world exploded. A sound, sharp and clear, echoed in his head. His own breathing, heavy and ragged. A distant car horn blaring somewhere, a bird cawing from a tree above them. The sound of the water splashing in the fountain, the rustle of wind against the marble stone. All of it, alive, real. Leo froze, his heart thudding in his chest. For the first time in his life, he could hear, "Dad." The words slipped from his lips, barely above a whisper, but the sound of his own voice, the vibration of it, sent shockwaves through his body. His mouth parted in disbelief. He touched his throat, as if he didn't recognize it. "Dad," he whispered again, this time louder, with more force. His voice shattered the quiet like a sudden crack in glass. Ella froze, staring at Leo. Her breath caught in her chest as she realized what had happened. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his hands trembling as he pressed them to his ears, afraid that the sound would vanish, afraid that this miracle was only temporary. He shook his head, as if trying to grasp the reality of what he had just experienced. Ella's fingers trembled as she held the strange husk between them. It pulsed again, faintly, like it was alive, like it had a purpose that Leo, until now, had never known. She watched him, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to process this moment that felt almost too surreal. But before either of them could speak, the sound of rapid footsteps broke the moment. A voice, sharply cut through the air. "What's going on here?" Alexander Harrison appeared in the doorway of the glass building, his face already flushed with frustration. His eyes immediately locked onto Leo, who was still trembling, still holding his ears as if he couldn't quite believe the noise around him. His gaze shifted to Ella, the barefoot girl standing too close to his son, and his expression darkened. "What are you doing with my son?" Alexander demanded, his voice harsh, authoritative. His eyes narrowed, scanning the girl with an edge of suspicion. "Who are you? What did you do to him?" Ella instinctively stepped back, holding her hands up in front of her. "I didn't," she began, but her voice faltered under the weight of his scrutiny. Leo turned to his father, his wide, shocked eyes still filled with disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak again, but his voice trembled too much to form coherent words. "Dad," Leo finally managed, his voice cracking on the syllable. The word hung in the air, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Alexander's face paled. He staggered forward, his eyes wide with shock as he stared at his son. The son who had never spoken a word in all his 11 years of life. And now, Here he was, calling out to him. The world, for just a moment, seemed to slow down, the weight of Leo's words reverberating in his ears. For the first time, Alexander's control, the thing he had built his empire upon, seemed to slip. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked back at Ella, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. "What did you do?" he repeated, his voice more controlled now, though the fury still flickered in his eyes. "I didn't do anything," Ella said quickly, her voice shaking. I just helped him. He needed help and—" Before she could finish, Leo's voice broke through again. I heard you," he said softly, as if testing the sound of his own words, as if afraid the sound would fade once more. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time. And in that moment, as Leo stood before him, his hands still clutching his ears, Alexander realized something that had never occurred to him before. He had never truly listened. His world, built on wealth and power, had been too loud, too busy, too distracted to hear the silence his son had lived with. The silence that had been so much more than just a lack of sound. It had been a barrier that now seemed to crumble with every breath Leo took. And then, for the briefest of moments, a part of Alexander's world, the part that had always felt invincible, shattered. He looked at Ella, the girl who had shown him something he could never have imagined. "Get away from him," Alexander ordered, his voice tinged with something darker now. Fear, perhaps, or jealousy. But Leo, shaking and overwhelmed, refused to be pushed away. "No, don't. I heard it, Dad. I heard it," he cried out, his voice more desperate now. Alexander stood frozen in place, as if a wave had just crashed over him. His mind couldn't quite make sense of it all. Could this really be happening? Ella held up the black husk in her hand, her voice barely audible. "This was inside him," she said. "Something was blocking him. You didn't see it. You didn't listen." Alexander's expression faltered, and his lips parted in disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered under his breath. Ella's eyes met his, sharp and defiant. "Maybe not. Maybe you just never looked close enough." The tension in the air was thick, but the world around them had already shifted. A miracle had been born from a simple, unexpected act, and nothing would ever be the same again. The sound of Leo's voice, his first real words in over 9 years, ripped through the tension that had thickened the air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a tremor, a crack in the universe of silence he had been living in. A voice that, for all of Alexander's wealth and resources, had never once found its way out before. "Dad." The single word hung between them, fragile and trembling, but impossible to ignore. The rush of it hit Alexander like a tidal wave, and he froze, staring at his son. Leo, his small hands still pressed against his ears, looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes, as though terrified that his words would vanish into the ether. For a moment, the courtyard seemed to stop. The sounds of the city, the hum of passing traffic, and the gentle splash of the fountain, all fell away. All Alexander could hear was that one word, that one impossible utterance. His son, his deaf son, had spoken. Not just spoken, but spoken to him. His first word, the one he had waited for so long to hear. And yet, a part of him wanted to deny it. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be. For years, Alexander had lived in the cold certainty that Leo's condition was irreversible. Every doctor, every expert, every test had said the same thing. Leo's hearing was gone, beyond recovery, and that was the end of it. Money, status, and connections had meant nothing in the face of the relentless finality of that diagnosis. But now, in front of him, his son was speaking. "Dad!" Leo said again, his voice cracking on the word as if he were still testing it, unsure whether it would last. His hands were shaking, but his eyes, wide with wonder, stayed locked on his father. Alexander's pulse quickened. His brain was scrambling to catch up, to make sense of what he was seeing, what he was hearing. This was impossible. This was a dream. Leo! Alexander's voice was a strained whisper, as though he were afraid that if he spoke too loudly, the miracle would vanish. He took a step forward, his hands trembling as they hovered over his son. How? How can this be? Leo clutched his ears, his body trembling, as if afraid the world would fall silent again. He opened his mouth, his lips quivering, desperate to speak more. But the words seemed stuck, trapped behind his fear and disbelief. Ella stood silently at a distance, watching them. She didn't move to comfort Leo. She didn't rush forward to claim credit for the moment. She just stood there, watching with a quiet sense of understanding that only those who had known the sting of loss could comprehend. Alexander's gaze shifted to her, and the disbelief that had clouded his thoughts was replaced by something sharper: anger. How could this girl, this stranger, be the one to unlock what the best specialists had failed to even touch? He had thrown millions of dollars into research, treatments, surgeries, and yet all of them had come to nothing. How dare she waltz in and do what no one else had been able to? He stepped toward her, his eyes cold, his voice hardening. "What did you do?" he demanded, his words like ice. "What did you put in his ear?" Ella didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She simply raised her hand, the small black husk still held between her fingers. It seemed almost out of place in her palm. So small, so insignificant, and yet so powerful. It was as if the object held the key to everything Alexander had spent years searching for. "I didn't put anything in his ear," Ella replied calmly. Her voice was quiet but steady, the kind of calm that only comes from knowing something deeper than the surface anger surrounding her. I listened." She paused, her eyes meeting Alexander's with a quiet defiance. "I felt that something was wrong. I knew there was more to it than just deafness, so I looked." Alexander's lips pressed into a thin line. His skepticism hardened, and he turned back to Leo, whose wide eyes were still fixed on him, a mix of hope and fear in them. "No," Alexander muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "No, this doesn't make sense. This isn't real." But the words were hollow, lacking the certainty that usually accompanied them. Deep down, a flicker of doubt had begun to creep in, something Alexander had never allowed himself to feel. Not in his business, not in his life, and certainly not in the control he had over his family. Leo's hands dropped from his ears, and he looked at his father, a small, tentative smile on his face. "Dad," he said again, more firmly this time, as though testing the weight of the word. He was looking for something: validation, recognition, a sense of connection. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. It felt as though everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was crumbling in front of him. His son, the one person who had always remained silent, was speaking. And in that moment, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. He had always believed that wealth could solve any problem, that money could buy solutions, could buy control, could buy love. But this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved by the size of his bank account. And that realization hurt more than anything else ever had. "No," he said again, his voice louder now, more forceful. He reached for Leo, pulling him away from Ella. "You need to go," he demanded, his words laced with authority, as if the situation were still within his grasp. "Now." Leo flinched as his father's hand gripped his arm, pulling him away from the girl who had done what no one else had been able to do. The warmth of his father's touch was cold, devoid of any sense of care or understanding. Leo looked back at Ella, his eyes pleading. "I heard it, Dad," Leo said, his voice quiet but steady. "I heard the bird, the water, everything." Alexander shook his head, a knot tightening in his stomach. "You didn't hear anything," he snapped, his voice sharp. "It's just your imagination. Nothing's changed." But Leo didn't pull away. He held his father's gaze, and for the first time in his life, there was something in his eyes that Alexander couldn't ignore. Something raw, something honest. "I heard it," Leo said again, his voice trembling but sure. "I really heard it." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of those words. The fountain's steady rhythm in the background felt louder now, sharper, more present. The noise of the world outside pressed in on them, a world that Leo could finally be a part of. Ella remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides. She hadn't moved an inch. She was quiet, unbothered by the anger that had flared in Alexander's eyes. "Look," Ella said, her voice calm, almost detached. "All I did was listen. I didn't fix anything. I didn't force anything. I just saw that he was in pain, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to it than what the doctors told you." Alexander's chest tightened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His mind was racing, but no matter how fast it moved, it couldn't catch up to the weight of what was happening before him. Ella stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Alexander's. "You didn't see your son," she said softly, yet every word felt like a blow. "You didn't listen to him. You only listened to the doctors, to the money, to the system that told you it was all hopeless." The truth of her words hit him harder than he was willing to admit. The pain, the truth, the shame, all of it hung in the air, and he couldn't push it away. "I didn't know," he whispered, barely audible. The confession stung more than he ever imagined it would. "I didn't know." Ella's expression softened just a fraction. "Now you do," she said quietly. Alexander looked back at Leo, whose eyes were filled with uncertainty, but also with something else: hope. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, one Alexander had never truly embraced. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to do next. The sterile white walls of the clinic seemed to close in on Alexander as he sat in the uncomfortable chair across from the doctor. His gaze was fixed on the screen, where the scans of Leo's brain and auditory system were displayed in neat, digital clarity. It should have been a moment of triumph, proof that his son was no longer silent, no longer trapped in his own world. But instead, it was a moment of frustration. A moment that felt like a door was closing on him when he needed answers most. Leo sat beside him, his small hands nervously clutching the armrest of his chair. His wide eyes scanned the room, still overwhelmed by the flood of new sounds, the rustle of papers, the soft murmur of the nurse outside the room, the hum of the air conditioning. He had never been surrounded by so much noise before, and each sound seemed to fill him with both awe and apprehension. It was as if the world had suddenly come alive in ways he had never known. Ella, standing quietly in the corner, seemed unfazed by the clinical environment. She was still barefoot, still wearing the same simple clothes she had worn in the courtyard earlier. She wasn't a part of this world of polished doctors, clean labs, and endless medical jargon. She wasn't a patient, and she wasn't an expert. But in a way, she was the only one who seemed to know what was happening. Dr. Marlowe, the clinic's lead physician, adjusted his glasses as he turned to Alexander. His voice was calm, almost clinical, but there was an undertone of uncertainty in his words. "The scans are clear," Dr. Marlowe said, tapping the keyboard to bring up the results on the screen. "There's no physical or neurological explanation for Leo's sudden improvement. The hearing aids are functioning as they should. There's no new data indicating any change in the condition we've diagnosed." Alexander's hands tightened into fists. He could feel the frustration rising in his chest, the suffocating sense of helplessness creeping up once again. For all the money, all the years of research, and all the specialists he had consulted, this was the answer he had received: nothing. "You're telling me there's no explanation?" Alexander's voice was tight with anger, the words almost too hard to contain. "How can this be? My son is hearing. He's speaking. And you're telling me that there's no reason why?" Dr. Marlowe adjusted his glasses again, clearly uncomfortable under Alexander's scrutiny. "I'm not saying that," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's simply unprecedented. The condition has improved in a way that defies our understanding of the medical science behind it. It's not what we would expect from a child with Leo's diagnosis." "And yet," Alexander pressed, "he's speaking. He's hearing. Isn't that all the evidence I need?" Dr. Marlowe hesitated before responding. I understand your frustration, Mr. Harrison, but without a clear medical cause, we cannot explain the how of it. What we can say is that Leo's sudden improvement doesn't align with anything we know about his condition. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking between his father and the doctor. He hadn't spoken much since the initial outburst of his voice, and now the reality of the situation was settling in. Despite hearing the sounds around him, despite the miracle that had taken place in the courtyard, there was still no explanation. Nothing concrete. Nothing to explain the impossible. "Dad," Leo said quietly, his voice unsure. Will it go away?" Alexander's heart clenched at the sound of his son's words. The fear in Leo's eyes was enough to bring him back to reality. Leo, despite all the wonder, was still uncertain, still afraid that the miracle would slip away as quickly as it had come. "No, Leo," Alexander replied, his voice softer now. "I promise you, it won't go away." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his own mind. What if it did? Ella, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm but firm, as though she had already made her own judgment about what was happening. "I don't think you've looked closely enough," she said, her eyes locking onto Dr. Marlowe. Dr. Marlowe's gaze flickered, a hint of defensiveness appearing on his face. "Excuse me?" Ella's expression was unwavering. "You're looking at the scans. You're looking at the data. But you're not listening to what's right in front of you." She glanced at Leo, who was staring at her with curiosity, and then back at the doctor. "I've spent years with people who were dismissed by the medical system. People like my brother, who were told that nothing could be done, that their condition was incurable. But I know something you don't. Sometimes, the answer isn't in the charts or the numbers. Sometimes, the answer is in the things you can't measure, the things you don't look for." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Alexander saw something shift in the doctor's expression. It wasn't a change he could quite name, but it was there, a flicker of uncertainty, of something deeper than the surface-level expertise he had so carefully constructed. I don't understand what you mean," Dr. Marlowe said, his voice more guarded now. Ella didn't break her gaze. "Maybe you never really looked at Leo. Maybe you just assumed that his deafness was all there was. But what if it's not? What if there was something inside him that you didn't see? Something that was missed?" Dr. Marlowe's silence was the loudest thing in the room. He looked at Alexander, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Alexander felt the growing knot in his stomach, a slow realization starting to form. Could it be possible? Had they missed something? "We've done every test," Dr. Marlowe said, as though repeating it would make it true. "Every scan, every procedure. There's no explanation for this. It's impossible." Ella's voice softened, but the calmness of it made it all the more powerful. "Maybe that's the problem. You've been so focused on the science, on the data, that you've forgotten about the people in front of you. The things that can't be quantified, the things that matter the most." Alexander turned back to Leo, who was now staring at him with wide, hopeful eyes, still processing the sounds around him. He could hear everything: the rustle of paper on the desk, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of voices from the hallway. It was all so overwhelming, so new. Leo blinked, looking at his father, and a smile, tentative but real, formed on his face. "I can hear the birds," Leo whispered, his voice small but full of wonder. "I never heard them before. I can hear the cars, the air." Alexander's heart swelled with a strange mixture of pride and sorrow. His son was adapting to the world that had once been so silent. But there was still so much unknown, still so much uncertainty, and the medical community had no answers, no clear path forward. "I don't understand this," Alexander said, his voice quiet, almost to himself. "I don't understand how this is possible." Ella's voice broke through his thoughts. "Maybe you don't need to understand it. Maybe you just need to listen to Leo. And maybe, just maybe, you need to start questioning everything you've been told." The words stung, but they were true. Alexander had spent his entire life believing in control, believing that with enough resources, enough power, he could fix anything. But Leo's condition had shown him how wrong that belief had been. And now, the answers he sought were slipping further from his grasp. Not because they were out of reach, but because they were hidden in places he hadn't bothered to look. As the doctor fell silent, Alexander watched Leo, listening to the world around him with wide-eyed amazement. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood what was truly important. The miracle wasn't in the science. It was in the sound of his son's voice, in the quiet moments where the world finally felt like it could be heard. And maybe that was enough. The private office was cold, sterile, as though designed to distance the patient from any semblance of warmth or comfort. Alexander stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline, the morning light streaming through the glass, casting harsh shadows on the floor. He had never felt so disoriented, so lost, standing in a place where the answers should have been clear, but were instead shrouded in lies and deception. Across from him, Dr. Marlowe sat at his desk, his posture rigid, hands folded on the surface in front of him, eyes cast downward, as if avoiding the weight of the conversation to come. Ella sat in the corner, her presence quiet but powerful. She was the only one not looking for answers from the medical community, the only one who had never doubted what had happened with Leo. But Alexander had. He had doubted every moment of the journey, every step, every test, every doctor's reassurance. And now, as the truth seemed to finally break through the surface, it threatened to drown him. "You wanted to see me," Dr. Marlowe said, his voice tinged with the faintest trace of discomfort. But there was no hiding the slight wariness in his eyes. It had been a few days since the clinic, a few days since the inexplicable change in Leo's condition, and yet Alexander could still feel the ripples of uncertainty in the air. "I wanted to understand," Alexander said, his voice tight with control, though the words felt as though they were being forced out. "I want to know how my son, after all these years, can suddenly hear. I want to know why your tests, your so-called final tests, showed no reason for his improvement." Dr. Marlowe shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses before speaking again. "Mr. Harrison, I understand that you're looking for answers, but the truth is that we've already explored every avenue. Leo's condition, it's complicated, it's rare, and there's just no clinical explanation." "No clinical explanation?" Alexander's voice rose, the control he had been holding on to slipping away. He turned to face the doctor, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "Don't feed me that. I've heard it before. You've been treating my son for years, and now you're telling me there's no explanation? After everything? You've kept him in this condition for what? For profit?" Dr. Marlowe didn't respond immediately. His hands gripped the edge of the desk, and for a moment, Alexander thought he might refuse to answer, or worse, try to justify the unthinkable. But then the doctor spoke, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I don't know how to say this, Mr. Harrison, but there are things about Leo's condition that we never told you. Things we've kept from you." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. His throat tightened, his stomach turning as he tried to process what he was hearing. "What do you mean, things? What things?" Dr. Marlowe swallowed hard, the weight of his confession clearly heavy on him. "The treatment plan we've been using for Leo, it was extended. It was lucrative for the hospital. The longer we kept Leo in therapy, the more money was made. The more procedures, the more tests. It was easier that way." The words hung in the air like a foul stench, impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. Alexander's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. He felt sick, sick with rage, sick with the realization that his own trust had been violated in the most egregious way. "You kept him in this condition?" Alexander's voice cracked as the enormity of the betrayal sunk in. "You told me for years that his condition was incurable, that there was nothing more to be done. But all this time, you kept him deaf for money?" Dr. Marlowe's face contorted with guilt, his eyes darting around the room, as though searching for an escape. "It wasn't like that. We never intended to. It's just the way the system works. The treatment plans, the funding. It was all designed to extend, to keep going. You have to understand, Mr. Harrison. This isn't about just one patient. It's the system. The whole system. Ella, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but the anger behind it was palpable. No, it's not the system, she said, her gaze fixed on Dr. Marlowe with unwavering intensity. It's you. You saw a child who needed help, and you saw a paycheck. You didn't see a boy who was desperate for answers, for care. You saw a source of income. Dr. Marlowe's face flushed a deep shade of red, but he said nothing in defense of his actions. He didn't have a defense. The truth had been exposed, and there was nothing left to hide. Alexander felt his entire world shift beneath him. He had spent so many years fighting to make Leo's life better, believing that money could solve their problems. He had trusted the doctors, trusted the specialists, trusted the system that promised to heal his son. And now, the very system that he had relied on, that he had funded, had betrayed him. He reached for the medical files stacked on the desk in front of Dr. Marlowe. His hands trembled as he sifted through them, each paper filled with meaningless jargon and hollow assurances. But then, near the bottom of the stack, a hidden memo caught his eye. His pulse quickened as he read the words aloud. Harrison account approved for extended treatment. Maintain diagnosis to secure funding. His breath caught in his throat. This was the plan? To keep Leo in treatment forever? To never find a cure? To keep him dependent on the system? For money? The doctor's silence was all the answer he needed. For a long moment, Alexander stood there, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. His mind couldn't comprehend the full extent of what had happened. His entire life, his entire understanding of the world seemed to be crumbling. And it was all because the people he had trusted, who he had paid to help his son, had taken advantage of him. Of Leo. Ella stepped forward again, her presence a quiet but unyielding force. You didn't see a child, Dr. Marlowe, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. You saw a paycheck. Alexander's heart clenched at the finality of Ella's words. She was right. All this time, all the money, all the research, none of it had been about Leo. It had been about sustaining the system, about exploiting Leo's condition to line the pockets of those who were supposed to help him. But now that he knew the truth, there was no going back. I won't let this happen again, Alexander muttered under his breath. His hands clenched into fists, the anger boiling over as he looked at Dr. Marlowe. I'll expose this. I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Dr. Marlowe seemed to shrink under the weight of Alexander's words. Mr. Harrison, please. No, Alexander said, his voice like steel. You don't get to make excuses anymore. I trusted you with my son's life, and you betrayed that trust. You made money off his pain. And now, I'm going to make sure that no one else is ever treated like this again. As the room fell into silence, Leo, who had been quietly sitting by the door, spoke softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Don't fight, Dad. Please don't fight. Alexander turned to his son, his heart breaking at the sight of the boy, his boy, who had been through so much. Leo's eyes were wide with emotion, but there was no fear in them. Only the quiet plea for peace. Leo didn't understand all that was happening, but he understood love. And in that moment, Alexander realized that this was the real miracle. Not the noise, not the words, not the anger or betrayal, but the love between them. The promise that they would never be silenced again. He knelt beside Leo, taking his hand in his. I'm sorry, Leo, he whispered. I failed you. But I won't let anyone hurt you again. I promise. Ella watched them in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. She had brought them together, but it was Leo's voice that had finally broken through. The world had changed that day in the courtyard, and it was no longer about money, power, or prestige. It was about listening, about seeing the truth for what it was. And in that truth, there was healing. The weight of the city pressed down on Alexander as he sat alone in his office. The walls around him, once comforting in their familiarity, now felt like a cage, closing in with every passing minute. The glass window before him, which had once symbolized his ambition, now reflected a version of himself he couldn't recognize. The man who had spent his life building empires, who had thought he could buy anything, including his son's health, was now broken, unraveling beneath the crushing guilt of his own ignorance. Leo's first words, "Dad," still echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of the years lost. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers running through his hair as his mind churned with thoughts of what could have been. His son, his beautiful boy, had been robbed of so much. Years of hearing, years of communication, years of connection. All because Alexander had placed his trust in a broken system, one that had failed him and Leo in the most unforgivable way. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all bearing down on him. How could I have been so blind? The guilt was suffocating. It wasn't just the fact that Leo had spent so many years in silence. It was that Alexander had allowed it. He had spent years throwing money at the problem, believing that his wealth could fix anything, believing that medical experts with their suits and their degrees had all the answers. He had convinced himself that his privilege could solve the unspoken rift between him and his son. But in the process, he had lost sight of the most important thing, Leo himself. And now, the truth had come crashing down. The same doctors, the same specialists he had trusted, had exploited his son's condition for their own gain. And he, with all his wealth and influence, had never questioned it. I failed him. There was no other way to put it. Alexander had failed Leo. He had failed as a father, as a protector, as someone who should have listened. Instead, he had let his own arrogance and trust in the system dictate the course of his son's life. He stood up abruptly, pacing the length of his office. The anger, once directed at the doctors and the system, now burned inward. How could he have let this happen? How had he not seen it before? Every diagnosis, every consultation, every promise had been a lie. They had all been complicit in the silent theft of Leo's life, and Alexander had been blind to it. His gaze fell on a picture of Leo and him taken years ago, before the silence had fully taken hold. It was a photograph of a happier time, when Leo's eyes sparkled with curiosity, when he had a voice that could fill a room. What happened to that boy? Alexander wondered. And more painfully, what happened to me? Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door, pulling him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse, betraying the turmoil inside. Ella stepped into the room, her presence calm, almost serene. She had been a constant, a quiet reminder of everything Alexander had been too blind to see. She was still wearing her simple clothes, still barefoot, as if she belonged to a world untouched by the pretensions of wealth and power. She didn't need the trappings of success to make a difference. All she needed was her heart, and the willingness to act when it was needed most. She didn't speak immediately, just stood there, observing him. Alexander didn't look up, afraid that if he did, the guilt would overwhelm him even more. "Are you okay?" she finally asked, her voice soft but carrying an unspoken understanding. Alexander closed his eyes, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't okay. He would never be okay. Not until Leo had the life he deserved. Not until he made things right. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not okay." Ella stepped closer, her gaze steady. "It's not easy," she said simply. "The truth never is. But you have to face it, Alexander. You can't change the past, but you can change what happens next." The words stung. He knew they were true, but they didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. "Do you ever forgive yourself for the things you've done?" he asked her, his voice low, the question lingering in the air. Ella didn't hesitate. "I don't forgive myself for the things I've done," she said quietly. "But I try to learn from them, to make things right where I can. And sometimes, that's enough." Alexander turned to face her, his eyes searching hers for something, some kind of clarity, some kind of answer he had been hoping she could provide. "I don't know how to fix this, Ella. I don't know how to fix him. I don't know how to fix what I've done. Ella nodded, her expression softening. You don't have to fix everything. You just have to start by listening, by being there for him. That's where the real change begins. She was right. He had been so consumed by the desire to fix things, by the belief that money and influence could solve everything, that he had forgotten the most important thing of all. His son needed him to listen. Not as a billionaire, not as a powerful man, but as a father. Just a father. I've been so wrong, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. I've let my privilege blind me. I've let it take away the one thing that could have helped him, my presence, my love. And now I'm afraid I've lost him. Ella stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. You haven't lost him. He's right there. All you need to do is reach out. Alexander nodded, taking a deep breath. He needed to do this. For Leo. For himself. He needed to fix this. Not with money, not with influence, but with time, with attention, and with love. Later that evening, in the quiet of their home, Alexander sat on the couch next to Leo, who was still adjusting to the new world of sound. It was overwhelming for him, but his eyes sparkled with curiosity, and every new noise seemed to fill him with wonder. Leo looked at his father, his small hands fidgeting in his lap. Dad? He asked, his voice tentative, still testing the boundaries of this new reality. Yes, Leo, Alexander replied, his heart aching at the sound of his son's voice. It was still so raw, so new, but it felt like the most precious thing in the world. I'm scared, Leo whispered, his voice trembling just slightly. Alexander's heart clenched. Scared. The word sent a ripple of emotion through him, and he realized just how much he had failed to see. How many times had Leo been scared, trapped in his silence, unable to reach out, unable to express his fears? I know, Leo, Alexander said softly, taking his son's hand in his. I know you're scared, but I promise you, I'm here. I'll always be here. For a long moment, they just sat together in silence, the weight of the world between them slowly dissipating. Alexander could feel the shift in their relationship. He could feel the trust returning, little by little, as he began to listen. Not as a father with all the answers, but as a father who had finally learned to hear. I've failed you, Alexander admitted, his voice breaking. But I won't fail you again, Leo. I promise I'll listen. I'll hear you. Every single time. Leo looked up at him, his eyes wide, filled with the vulnerability of a child who had been waiting for this moment for so long. I'm not broken, am I? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Leo, Alexander said, his voice firm but gentle. You're not broken. You're perfect. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that. And in that moment, something shifted between them. The years of silence, of missed opportunities, of regret. All of it began to fade, replaced by a new understanding. Alexander knew that he couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. He could be the father Leo deserved. He wrapped his arms around Leo, holding him close. I'm sorry, he whispered again, the words heavy with meaning. I'm so sorry. Leo snuggled into his embrace, his small frame trembling, but his heart full. I'm not mad, Dad, he said softly. I just want to hear everything. Alexander held him tighter, his heart swelling with love. And from now on, Leo, you'll hear everything, he thought. Everything you deserve. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade a reminder of the battle they had fought, the battle that had changed everything. Alexander stood at the steps, Leo by his side, and Ella just a few feet away, her eyes scanning the city beyond. The morning sunlight reflected off the marble, bathing them in a soft golden light that felt almost too peaceful for the storm that had raged in their lives only weeks ago. They had come to the end of a long road. The case against the clinic had been settled, the public outrage had subsided, and the media, once obsessed with their every move, had moved on to the next headline. But the lessons they had learned, the truths that had been uncovered, were far from gone. They had changed in ways that could never be undone. Leo, still adjusting to the world of sound, stood quietly, his eyes flicking between his father and Ella. His small hand rested in Alexander's, a simple, unspoken connection that spoke volumes. The world around them was alive with sound, the distant murmur of traffic, the chatter of people passing by, the rustle of the leaves in the trees, and Leo could hear it all. He could hear the rhythm of life, and it was a sound Alexander had never fully appreciated until now. As they stood there, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to settle on Alexander's shoulders. It wasn't the weight of victory or defeat that pressed him down. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was the realization that nothing he had built, nothing he had accumulated, could ever replace the simple, irreplaceable value of human connection. That the moments that truly mattered, those precious moments that could never be bought, were the ones he had almost lost. Alexander turned to face Ella, his eyes searching her face. He had learned so much from her, more than he could ever fully express. She had shown him the way, had reminded him of what truly mattered. But now, as they reached the end of this chapter, he knew it was time for her to go. "Ella," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet gratitude. "What you did for Leo, for us, I'll never be able to thank you enough." Ella smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Alexander. I did what anyone would have done." She paused, glancing down at Leo, her expression softening. "You've come a long way. You've learned what really matters, and that's more than most people ever realize." Alexander nodded, the weight of her words settling into him. "I've learned a lot," he said softly. "I've learned that money, power, influence, they can't fix what's broken inside us. What's really important is listening." His gaze flickered to Leo, who was watching them both intently. "I've learned that love, understanding, and connection are the things that truly matter." Ella's smile grew, though it remained tinged with a quiet sadness. "You'll be a good father to him, Alexander. You already are." She paused, looking around at the courthouse, the scene of so much conflict and turmoil. "But there's one more thing you need to remember. Don't just listen to those you can hear. Listen to those who can't speak. They have just as much to say." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alexander looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude, but also with the painful realization that she was right. There were so many voices that went unheard in the world, so many people who were silenced, ignored, forgotten. And in that moment, he knew that his work wasn't done, not just for Leo, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. Ella turned to leave, her steps light but determined. She didn't look back, but Alexander knew she didn't need to. Her role in their lives had been fulfilled. She had given them the gift of listening, and now it was time for her to move on, to return to the life she had known before they had crossed paths. She was the quiet force that had set everything into motion, but now she was fading into the background once again. "Goodbye, Ella," Alexander whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. And as she disappeared into the crowd, he felt something shift in him, something that had been broken finally beginning to heal. He was no longer the man who believed he could buy his way out of anything. He was no longer the man who had placed wealth and power above the simple, irreplaceable connections with those he loved. He was just a father. Leo turned to him, a soft smile on his face. "Dad," he said, his voice still quiet but growing stronger with each passing day. "Where's Ella going?" "She's going back to where she belongs," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She's always known what's important, and she's given us a chance to figure it out." Leo nodded, though his brow furrowed in confusion. "I'll miss her." "I know," Alexander said, his voice filled with tenderness. "But we'll always remember her, and we'll always remember what she taught us." Leo took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling. "I can hear everything now, Dad," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "And I think I understand." Alexander smiled, his heart swelling. You do, Leo. You really do. And in that moment, the final piece fell into place for Alexander. He had spent so much time trying to fix things, trying to control things. But what he had never realized was that the true healing came from something simpler. Understanding, listening, connecting. He had been blind to the most basic truths, but now, as he stood with his son, watching the world unfold around them, he saw everything clearly for the first time. He had always been searching for something to fill the void, something to make him whole. But the answer had been there all along, in the quiet moments with Leo, in the sounds of the world, in the small, precious connections that defined their lives. "Dad," Leo said, breaking his thoughts. "What do you hear?" Alexander looked down at his son, his heart full. "I hear everything, Leo," he said, his voice soft but strong. "And I'll never let you live in silence again. Not while I'm breathing." The promise hung in the air between them, a bond stronger than anything money or power could ever provide. For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly human. Not as a businessman, not as a man of influence, but as a father who had finally learned what it meant to listen. And in that moment, everything changed. They walked away from the courthouse together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever the future held. No longer blinded by pride or power, Alexander knew that the impossible had happened, and with it, a new chapter of their lives had begun. Not just for Leo, but for him too. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander's voice didn't carry the force of power. It carried the gentleness of love.